G'day, welcome to Godless Australian. An announcement. Australia is having an election. Hooray! I know. So now Australians are all getting up and ready to change their smoke alarm batteries because we've been getting basically a new Prime Minister every 3 months or something like that. It's ridiculous. Because we're having an election, I thought to myself, I might as well have a look at our potential Prime Ministers coming up, our current PM, who is Scott Morrison, and our potential new Prime Minister, who is Bill Shorten. Remember, I'm not bothering to learn their names. They're probably not going to be my PM in the next couple of months anyway. So I thought I'd look into them, look into their religious thoughts and beliefs. And I also decided to do a small rubric that, in my personal thoughts and beliefs, really coincide quite strongly with religious beliefs. So I'm only going to do Scott Morrison and Bill Shorten. If I have enough time, I might do some of the other ones. So we'll see how I go. The rubric I've used to show a fair comparison between the two political party leaders is their stances on gay marriage and LGBTQIA issues, abortion, euthanasia, climate change, education, especially higher education, the Safe Schools program, which is a program that was put out by people to stop bullying of LGBTQIA children in schools, and also to tackle homophobia, transphobia, and that sort of stuff in the general public. And the last one, of course, is science funding. The reasons why I chose these issues is because I believe personally that depending on a person's reaction towards these issues is also a good way to tell their personal religious convictions. There is no scientific evidence to support this. This is my personal opinion. So don't take this ironically as gospel. For those of you who aren't Australian, we have two major parties. We have the Liberal parties, which is confusingly the Conservative Party, and the Labor Party, which is slightly less conservative. I've looked into the current political party leaders, who are Scott Morrison, who's the Liberals, aka Conservative, because that makes total sense, and Bill Shorten, who is the Labor, which is slightly more left on the right-hand side of the political spectrum. I'm going to talk about the Liberal Party leader, Scott Morrison, first. So Scott Morrison is born on the 13th of May, 1968. He goes to Horizon Church, which is a Pentecostal church in the Sutherland Shire in Sydney. The average 3-bedroom house in the Sutherland Shire is worth $951,000, and the average weekly rent of a 3-bedroom house is $550 a week. Horizon Church is a very large facility which seats about 1,500 people, and it can be rented out to the public. Scott Morrison is socially conservative and very religious. He lists church as one of his interests, which is interesting. He's also been a guest on the right-wing radio show 2GB, which is hosted by Alan Jones. So basically, Australia's less crazy version of Steve Bannon. Scott Morrison, however, does claim that the Bible is not a policy handbook. He also subscribes to the idea of a fair go to those who have a go towards people on welfare. He is a proponent of trickle-down economics, and his attitudes are similar to that to Pentecostal pragmatism of only those who contribute financially into the country should reap the benefits. This is shown in him cutting taxes for the wealthy but refusing to raise New Start allowance, which is our social safety net. Gay marriage. So Scott Morrison was totally against gay marriage. He was a very, very strong supporter of the No campaign during the 2017 gay marriage plebiscite. He was even able to make it about religious persecution and religious people being discriminated against when Penny Wong, who was a Labor frontbencher at the time of the plebiscite and also a lesbian, she said that heterosexual politicians didn't understand the fear that is being felt by the LGBTQIA plus community. Scott Morrison made it all about religious persecution by saying People of very strong religious views, they have also been subjected to quite dreadful hate speech and bigotry as well. It is not confined to one side of this debate. I will admit there were some pretty awful things said about the other side from the Yes campaigners, but in my opinion, wasn't nearly as bad as the damage done to the LGBTQIA plus community during this plebiscite. Scott Morrison also called for protection of religious freedom for business owners. So he was one of the proponents to allow gay people to be rejected by small business owners if they did not agree with gay marriage. And a lot of people say, oh, well, then just don't go to this business. But that's all well and good in a highly population dense community such as cities or large regional towns. But if you live in a town where there's only one florist or one baker and they refuse to let you, refuse to sell you their services because you're a gay person getting married, that is problematic. On the other hand, he did say he was uncomfortable about the idea of gay kids being expelled from school if they are LGBTQIA+. Also, he initially backed Israel Folau's homophobic tweets in April 2018, saying that he has a strong character for standing up for his religious beliefs. But he has condemned Israel Folau's most recent homophobic tweets. Scarily, he also said that gay conversion therapy is not an issue for me, and he has no intention on getting involved in gay conversion therapy, which is scary because of his reluctance to get into condemning gay conversion therapy is problematic as it is being performed in Australia by fundamental religions, and the fact is he doesn't downright condemn this, even though it is considered a form of torture by the UN. Although he did condemn Brunei's anti-gay laws, which made it illegal to be gay and was punishable by death by stoning. Abortion. I couldn't actually find anything on him personally, what he thought of abortion, but I think it would be safe to assume he is pro-life. He did, however, lambast Labor for raising the issue of abortion just before the election, saying that the conversation is not good for the country. He also said that abortion is best for the states of Australia to control their own abortion laws. And that, of course, is problematic because if a person in a more restrictive abortion state, such as South Australia, cannot get to a less restrictive state, such as New South Wales or Queensland, they might be forced to keep the baby, and that's never a good thing. In New South Wales, it is a prosecutable offence to have an abortion, unless, of course, the doctor finds any economic, social, medical, or mental health grounds that abortion is necessary. Euthanasia. Scott Morrison is steadfast against euthanasia. In 2015, he said that he will never support voluntary euthanasia for terminally ill and dying patients. I couldn't find anything else that he said about euthanasia that is any newer because, as I said, this is 4 years old, so he might have changed his mind. You never know. People do that. Climate change. So the reason why I chose climate change is that it tends to be a slightly religious thing, I believe. As I said, there's no science backing it up, but I do believe that people who are religious are also more likely to be skeptical of climate change science. His policies on climate change is to stand by the Paris Agreement, which is a reduction of 26% of greenhouse gas emissions. Although, on the other hand, he did kind of shred the kids who protested against climate change inaction in late November 2018, and I don't think he praised the kids for the latest climate change protests as well. So I don't know how he feels about climate change. I also don't know if he agrees with the current consensus on climate change, but I do know he is in favour of coal mining. Famously, he did bring in a lump of coal into Parliament in 2017 while he was Treasurer of the Turnbull Parliament as a way to promote coal mining and fossil fuel energy. After he visited bushfire-affected areas in Tasmania, he was sort of yelled at a little bit by everyone, basically, after a journalist did ask him about climate change. But he refused to answer these questions because he didn't want to talk about policy or politics, which, in my opinion, is fair enough because, you know, it was a bit of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, because if he tried and talked about it, he could have also been lambasted for turning a tragedy into something that's political. So I'm going to give him a bit of a pass on this one. Education. This is an interesting one, actually. In 2017, Scott Morrison, as Treasurer, was able to successfully cut $2.1 billion out of the university sector by freezing funding increases. In December 2018, Scott Morrison government cut another $328.5 million towards funding for research universities as well. So I'll quote this from the Sydney Morning Herald. In quotations, Universities Australia estimates the cuts will hit research-intensive universities in New South Wales hardest, with a reduction of $91 million in funding availability to that state alone, end quote. To soften the blow, he sent $134.8 million towards rural universities so rural students are able to study. Because of these cuts, University Australia says that these funding cuts will cost the economy $12 billion, which was modelled by Cadence Economics. It doesn't say over how long, but got to admit, $12 billion is a little bit of money. On the other hand, Scott Morrison has allocated $4.6 billion towards independent and Catholic schools funding over a 10-year period. Safe schools. So this is what I mentioned earlier in the video about a program to help reduce LGBTQIA phobia. So that's just what a bit of a background. A lot of people who are fighting against it were talking about how it forces boys to come to school in a dress, where in fact safe schools have said if you want to come to school in a dress, you may. We are not going to stop you. And also they talk about role playing when in fact it was just that to use as a way to empathize with other people. So obviously, no surprises here. Scott Morrison is against safe schools. I think that's pretty clear. I haven't been able to find a specific tweet or a specific quote on safe schools, but he did enroll his daughters into an independent Baptist school because as a parent, he doesn't want values of others being imposed on them. Although that is his right as a parent, I also think as our Prime Minister, that is a really dangerous attitude, because if he is willing to other people that he doesn't agree with, then I don't think that's actually a particularly safe thing, because if he can't relate to all of his constituents, he's going to be a bad Prime Minister. Science funding. Scott Morrison has announced $2 billion towards projects to bring down Australia's climate change emissions, which is good. He also announced to uphold the $2.4 billion increase into research agencies such as the CSIRO, and that also includes the Australian Space Agency. There's also been increases in funding towards priority research such as cancer and genome research. So this sounds all well and good. As a true skeptic, I went to multiple sources, and that information I got was from his webpage. There's still an issue of cutting $328.5 million from research universities. And also, Australia currently spends 1.88% of its GDP on science and development, which is significantly less than the OECD average of 2.38%. Overall, I conclude that Scott Morrison and the Liberal Party seems to want to continue with their usual business-focused policies. He seems to have said some quite controversial things in regards to LGBTQIA people, discontinued funding and support for universities and higher education, and doesn't seem to think that climate change is as bad of a thing that it really is. So that's my take on Scott Morrison. Hey everyone, I thought I'd just clarify something. I realised that my breakdown of Bill Shorten is a lot shorter than that of Scott Morrison. And the reason being is not because of any political thoughts or anything about him. It was because I literally could not find anything on him in regards to controversial things he said. He's said some pretty silly things over the past, and that's fine because everyone makes mistakes. But I just thought I'd point that out because I'm sure someone in the comments will call me a leftist hack or something like that. Bill Shorten was born on Friday the 12th of May 1967. He was originally raised as a Catholic but became Anglican when he wanted to marry his second wife. Anglicanism was his new wife's religion, but Bill Shorten also wanted to move away from the Catholic Church as he had, and I quote, had come to disagree with the Catholic Church on a number of issues, including stem cell research, the right of women to control their own bodies, priestly marriage, and more lately, marriage equality. End of quote. I suppose you could also talk about second marriages in that one as well, Bill? No, fair enough. People are allowed to have a second marriage. Bill Shorten currently goes to St Thomas's Anglican Church at Moree Ponds. So the average 3-bedroom house at Moree Ponds in Melbourne is, and are you guys sitting down, $1,246,000, and the rent is $510 a week for a 3-bedroom house in this area. So yeah, there's some pretty expensive places around. St Thomas's seems to be a reasonably average sized church. I couldn't see anything on their website to see how many people that place can hold, so I can't do a comparison with that and Horizon Church. Its priest, however, is a female, and her name is Reverend Vanessa Bennett. Bill Shorten himself is a socially liberal person, being in favour of same-sex marriage and increasing New Start allowance. He does, however, say the Lord's Prayer, which is, as you would probably know, Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, blah, 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 before sitting in Parliament. He also wishes to maintain current exemptions to religious institutions in the Commonwealth anti-discrimination laws, which basically allows religious businesses and institutions to fire someone if they are gay. Gay marriage and homosexuality. As earlier stated, Bill Shorten is a proponent for gay marriage, and he campaigned yes during the gay marriage plebiscite. He pushed to stop religious schools from expelling students if they are LGBTQIA+. I have also linked in the description below news articles on the different variations of the law within Australia. If I told you it all now, you would be thoroughly confused. Labor has said that it will crack down on conversion therapy, which I would have thought should have been done years ago because, torture, UN, conversion therapy should kind of not be happening. So there's really not much more to say about Bill Shorten and his view on LGBTQIA+ people. He's in support of them. He was, however, stood up by drag queens, but apparently that was because they couldn't make it, not because of a political reason. But I still think it's funny that he got stood up by drag queens. It's, how bummed would you be? I would be pretty bummed. I'm like, damn it, I missed out on hanging out with drag queens. Abortion. Bill Shorten has said that Labor will overhaul Australia's abortion laws to be uniform across the country and also to decriminalise it. Labor has also pushed to make long-term removable contraceptions to be cheaper and more easily accessible, and to also remove barriers for the birth control bill. I couldn't find Bill Shorten's actual stance on abortion, but I would say it's safe to assume that he is actually pro-choice. Euthanasia. To be honest, I really couldn't find anything about Bill Shorten and his stance on euthanasia, other than to be cautious. That's it. He just said just be cautious. So that's, yeah. Climate change. Shorten seems to be frustrated at the lack of partisanship between Labor and Liberals on regards to climate change. He supports renewable energy and has received criticism on being unable to explain how much it's going to cost the country as we move towards renewables. He wants to also increase reducing climate change emitting gases to more than what is required of the Paris Climate Agreement. Education. In October 2018, Bill Shorten pledged $14.1 billion towards public schools if Labour wins the election. He also will remove that cap that I talked about earlier on universities and put in place by the Turnbull, then Morrison government over the past 2 years, as well as boosting this funding for universities. He also promised to allow our good friends from New Zealand to come over and actually access the student loans scheme, which is known as HECS, which is not available to international students. Australians, when we go to New Zealand, we can access their student loan schemes, but they can't here, which is a little bit wrong, in my opinion. Overall, he seems to be in favour of higher education, and not just for universities, but for TAFE as well, which is tertiary education, which you can do after school, but it's not a university. So if that kind of makes any sense. Safe schools. The most recent articles I found in regards to Bill Shorten and the safe schools have all been pre-2017. I have been trying to avoid anything from from earlier than 2017 because I want to concentrate only on this election cycle. So in this case, I will say that he has not decided to do anything about safe schools. Therefore, I will not comment on his attitude towards this program. Science funding. Bill Shorten seems to be in favour of increasing science funding and bringing it from 1.8% of our GDP up to 3%, which is higher than the average OECD. He's also promised extra funding for priority research in areas such as cancer research. So overall, Bill Shorten is actually quite a bit boring, in my opinion. Like, he doesn't really say anything terribly controversial, unless, of course, you don't like LGBTQIA plus people, public education and science funding. So that's the comparison between the two, and yeah, I hope that makes it easier for you to understand what's happening when we come up to this election. So overall, between the two, Scott Morrison is pro-business, pro-trickle-down economy, that sort of stuff, socially and economically conservative. Meanwhile, Bill Shorten is socially liberal, economically liberal, and not very interesting. It's basically my take on this. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope that cleared up a couple of your questions and thoughts on the upcoming election that we have to go through in May. And in the meantime, I hope you have a lovely day, evening, morning, whatever. And don't forget, don't give yourself the raw prawn.